All right, welcome to the podcast. Here we're going to talk about the interwar years in European history, mostly Western Europe,
but also Eastern Europe.
but also Eastern Europe. I'll let Evan take it away.
Okay, so last time we did World War One. So this will cover both the aftermath of that and the lead up to World War Two. We kind of covered the immediate aftermath in the last one, but something we didn't get to was that the creation of the countries of Poland and Ireland. These were also new countries. So Ireland had during World War One, they had this event called the Easter Rising. It was basically like the Irish, they saw the British as weak because they're involved in World War One, so they decided to form an uprising. It was eventually suppressed, often in a brutal way, by the groups called the Black and Tans. These were basically paramilitary, not basically police forces that were sent to keep the peace, but they really brutalized the population in Ireland. They were sent from the British.
Military
But after
police.
that, yeah, after that, they had the Irish War of Independence. Well, ultimately, they did gain their independence, with the exception of Northern Ireland, which had a large Protestant population that was more unionist, meant it had sympathies for the British and wanted to stay a part of the UK, but also did have a substantial Catholic minority, which would cause a lot of tensions in the years to come. And the other country, of course, is Poland, which was an independent country. You know, it had been an independent country in centuries past. It was ultimately, after the Napoleonic era, was split up between all other countries. But after World War One, it regained its independence. Countries of Austria, Germany, and Russian Empire kind of each gave land which would become the Polish state. The borders were a little bit different than Poland today, but it was its first time as an independent country. 1919 is kind of considered their national independence year. There's also the fact of the Soviets in Russia, they lost a lot of the territories from the Russian Empire. They tried to gain a lot of them back, especially in the Baltic and around the Georgia area, like south of the Caucasus. So they did ultimately gain that back. And one area was Armenia, which was an independent country for like a very short amount of time after the Armenian genocide before it was subsumed into the Soviet authorities. They also did try to invade Poland, but they ultimately failed in that. And this was also around the time shortly after that Lenin died, the leader of the revolution. And that's around that time was right when Stalin, started to rise to power, kind of astronomically. But during
Didn't
that
they
Lenin
wait, hold on. Didn't they also lose a lot of territory in the Baltic area, and basically this created the countries there, Finland and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania?
yeah, they tried to invade Finland, and there was kind of the Winter War between them and Finland. But they ultimately gained a lot of those territories back, but they kind of were stopped at Poland. And Lenin basically had a policy which is called the New Economic Policy. It was mainly in agriculture. Basically, they allowed, in contravention of the kind of socialist ideology, they allowed farmers to sell some of their surplus on the market because they knew that was the only way that they could get enough food to, kind of feed all the growing cities, or else they wouldn't have an incentive. Stalin would later, once he got into power, he'd later reverse that. He gained in like a farm collectivization kind of effort, which ultimately was very brutal. They kind of saw what were called rich peasants that had, since the days of the end of serfdom, had gained sort of some amount of, their own land, maybe a couple workers for them. Yeah, kulaks. He ultimately got a campaign against them where they were like killed en masse, and like anyone labeled an enemy could be seen as a kulak. Basically, if you didn't produce the right amount of quotas, you could be labeled that. But basically, and also there's the Holodemour in Ukraine a little later, which was basically the mass starvation of the Ukrainian people. That was it was intentional on Stalin's part. A lot of people try to deny it, but I mean, he did try to starve them.
It was kind of a police state.
Yeah, totally a police state. I mean, there was also a 5-year plan for industrialization, where Russia, I mean, it was kind of a very, impressive feat, though. They kind of industrialized a society that was still very feudal. It had been somewhat industrialized, but they kind of built a whole infrastructure, especially around the cities, that, hadn't been done before. I actually had one of my great-great-grandfathers worked on the Moscow subway system then.
Wow.
He was in the Soviet Union. He was an engineer, but So basically, he got a lot of help from industrialists in the West, like Henry Ford actually kind of advised him on opening up their first auto plants in the Soviet Union in that era. But during this period was basically Stalin became almost like basically a godlike figure, like basically like there was just so much propaganda on his personality. Trotsky was his main rival, actually. He had other rivals like Kamenev and Zinoviev, and he purged a ton of people in the top echelons. Basically, he's almost extremely paranoid person. He thought like anyone could challenge him and you'd be dead in like a second. But Trotsky kind of had a different idea. Like, while Stalin was focused on building up the power of the Soviet Union, Trotsky was more focused on kind of exporting the revolution to like other countries. And like he kind of had the idea that Marx said it would be like an international revolution, and that caused a lot of kind of tension with Stalin, whose his idea was first build up this country to be great. Then he thought like any other communist movement should be subordinate to the Soviet Union, basically.
And Lenin actually preferred Trotsky because he thought he was a nice
yeah,
person.
he knew Stalin would basically cause a bloodbath. I mean, Lenin was hardly like a very kind person himself, but even he knew Stalin was going to be like he would cause this kind of whole thing, mass death if he came to power.
Yeah, of course, Trotsky was kicked out of the Soviet Union, and he had to flee for the rest of his life.
Yeah, they also had the Great Purges, which were basically, it was both higher ups and just ordinary citizens like were killed en masse if they were suspected of disloyalty to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, in the Communist Party, believe it or not. Yeah, all Communist Party members were getting murdered.
They had the Moscow trials of people like Kamenev and Zinoviev, who were kind of brought up on trumped up charges and then later used as like a scapegoat so Stalin could execute. Like it was effective though. He kept total power. I mean, how brutal it was, but that was what's happening in Eastern Europe. Like West Russia would be the main country in Eastern Europe. Yeah,
I could talk about Turkey a little bit. Obviously, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led the Young Turks movement, overthrew the Ottoman Empire from within, a bit of a civil war there. And then it was in 1923 and 24, the Republic of Turkey was established. And its foreign policy from then on until now was to basically no longer just be fighting all these wars with Europe or in the Middle East, but to kind of be sort of a sentinel between the two regions. And ever since it became a republic, it's really tried to stay away from the political theaters of the Middle East and Europe, which is a radical change for any country at the time.
Yeah, and the Ottoman, and it was originally the Caliphate, and the Ottoman it explicitly identified a secular ideology as its state sort of thing, which is a huge change.
Yeah, the Sultanate there. Yeah, I believe the last Sultan was Mehmet the Sixth, and he was ousted by Ataturk. And then, then of course, there was a war between the Greeks and the Turkish that was instigated by the Greeks, and they wanted more land. They wanted to take back all the land that they lost, and hundreds of years ago, and especially Constantinople. And the Greeks ended up losing, and then the Turks end up taking eastern Thrace and a number of strategically important islands in now what is Asia Minor.
And I should also mention that Russia did have a civil war in the immediate aftermath between the whites, who were basically a broad-range anti-Bolshevik movement. Like, they contained some, ardent czarists who wanted to restore the absolute monarchy. They contained some elements that were more liberal, wanted to set up a more democratic tradition. But I mean, ultimately, and they did receive support internationally from various anti-communist governments. But even then, like, the Bolsheviks still had the upper hand. They were unified. They had the more strategic areas in like the western part of Russia. And ultimately, the whites just, kind of disintegrated. They couldn't, really win this.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of issues going on in Russia at the time. And in Turkey, it wasn't entirely different. They had a lot of people that weren't granted citizenship when the republic was formulated, and those people just weren't issued passports and all these things. They're basically stateless. And then there were certain groups like the Circassians and maybe some Kurds that were allowed to be citizens, but many Kurds were not allowed to be citizens of the new republic. and it was a
Well,
big.
yeah, that's still a problem today.
And that's still a problem today, but it's just funny that as soon as they become a republic, they immediately decide who can be in the republic and who can't.
Okay, let's get on to like the Versailles stuff and like the aftermath of that. So after that, there were war reparations, of course, put on Germany in Versailles. There were also basically like territorial changes. First of all, France regained Alsace-Lorraine. France's economy was also in shambles after this, but at least they thought it was worth it because they regained some sense of national pride, I guess.
Their economy was, the French economy was actually very good, considering everyone else, because they had all this reparation they had to chase down from the Germans, right? But they were able to kind of do it by sort of placating German resistance to payment. They were able to sort of coerce the Germans into paying them, and eventually they had to change the reparations on several occasions.
Yeah, the Dawes Plan.
Yeah, exactly. And then they occupied the Ruhr Valley, of course.
Yeah, and there was the demilitarization of the Rhineland that Hitler would later violate.
Yeah,
but basically, so Germany it wasn't ruined, but it was very reduced in status. All its colonies were gone.
But let me before we go to Germany, let's say something about France. And then from France, their economy was relatively okay initially, but then they had a radicalization process called the Popular Front that just created all this internal issues and confusion mainly. And that once the stock market crashes in New York and all the Europe gets affected by it, that kind of made France sort of a shit show. The whole radicalization combined with the stock market crashing.
Yeah. But like with Germany, okay, so they didn't suffer an internal strife as with the Spartacist rebellion, as remember, but they ultimately
Rosa Luxemburg was killed in the streets. Yeah. These communists that we're trying to they're trying to have a communist revolution in Germany.
Oh yeah, definitely. But a lot of people, there was some very heavy hyperinflation at first. There was huge economic depression, but at least until the Great Depression, Germany was actually on track to, fulfill its obligations. It wasn't the best shape, but it still was. And so we'll get to the Nazis at first. The Nazis,
well, let's wait. Let's first stipulate that this was an era for Germany after they stabilized, similar to the Roaring Twenties in the U.S., where they had an era of sort of expression, right? They had the Weimar Republic, and they had the German expressionist artists. Similarly, in France, they had the symbolist, movement that was kind of closing to an end. But in Germany, they had a very strong streak of liberality in the 20s.
Yeah, and that was what the Nazis, a lot of them, denounced heavily.
And the Nazis did not like that. No.
Yeah, but the Nazis were originally formed as basically a catch-all sort of German nationalist party, vehemently, obviously anti-Semitism was one of their things, also vehemently against the Versailles Treaty, but they were rather obscure, kind of fringe party that virtually no one outside of some select circles in Bavaria really even knew existed until an event called the Beer Hall Putsch, which was when Adolf
Hitler... Was it 1927?
No, that's 1923. This was when Adolf Hitler and a bunch of the other Nazis planned to take over the government of Bavaria, form a coup kind of there, and then use it as a ground to take over the rest of Germany. And it was foiled, and that a lot of the Nazis were sentenced to long prison sentences.
And this was in Munich.
But short prison sentences.
The funny thing was, this was in Munich, and they were able to get war hero Erich von Ludendorff to instigate the Beer Hall Putsch. And it's like we talk about it in the modern world as a failure, but it was a huge success for the Nazis because they're able to get these war leaders.
Publicity and martyrdom.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, not martyred, they weren't killed, but they were sentenced to prison at least for some years. That's where Hitler Mein Kampf, where a lot of the kind of
while he was in prison,
his ideology of the Nazi Party was formulated. There were other factions of the Nazi Party, like the Strasserists, who were more kind of what you'd consider the left wing of the Nazi Party, more kind of radical worker-based interpretation of that.
Can you say that name again?
The Strasserists, like Gregor and Otto Strasser. But Hitler's interpretation obviously would become the dominant one, which he wrote down in Mein Kampf. I mean, kind of one of the most infamous books of the 20th century.
Well, for sure.
But Germany until then, I mean, Well, the Great Depression was the turning point, obviously. That was when their economy collapsed again, and radical movements both on the left and the right started to gain huge popularity. The kind of moderate, more social democratic government couldn't really, hold it in together. But so there were elections, I believe, in 1932, I believe, and the Nazis did not gain a majority, but they gained a very, substantial minority. And Hindenburg was the prime minister. Now, none of these people
The word I believe is a plurality.
Yeah, plurality. Hindenburg was the prime minister, they're the president at the time.
Was he the prime minister or was he the chancellor?
I think it was let me think. Hindenburg was
Paul von Hindenburg.
Yeah,
who's also a World War
president
I war hero.
Yeah, but none of these people particularly liked the Nazis, but they knew that the extremes were getting some power, and they preferred the Nazis over the communists, basically. So, and he thought Hitler was just some novice who he could easily control, and he wouldn't have to do anything. Of course, he was very wrong about that. So he agreed to appoint Hitler chancellor to gain support of the Nazis, and then that's kind of when a lot of the Versailles started to be violated, obviously. But we'll get to France in this too. France had a political change too, not to the right, but to the left. You had Leo Blum was the first socialist Jewish prime minister of France.
Wait, I have a question. I have a question about the Nazis. Wasn't there a guy who was the leader of the Nazis who got assassinated by Hitler?
Oh yeah, that was the Night of the Long Knives. That was very early into the Nazis' realm. So basically, you had Hitler, who was the head of that. They also had sort of a paramilitary group of the Nazi Party called the SA, which was the precursor to the SS, which were the stormtroopers, basically. But they were controlled by a man named Ernst Röhm. And Ernst Röhm, he kind of had a different ideological view than Hitler. He thought that, because Hitler wanted to, consolidate his support among the establishment. Most famously, he, in exchange for business leaders, in the industrialist pledging support for the Nazis, he agreed to crush the trade union movement. So he had his radical ideology, but he still wanted to gain some establishment support. And the SA under at least Ernst Röhm wanted to continue these radical changes. And he ultimately saw him as both a threat to himself and a kind of, it would threaten the Nazi status with the German establishment. So he agreed. He had them all killed, the SA leadership, including Ernst Röhm, in an event called the Night of the Long Knives.
Yeah,
it was similar to it was kind of a lesser scale version of the Soviet purges of the kind of enemies.
Yeah, it was
a
more far smaller scaled version of that, but
yeah, more
still memorable. And it was interesting about at this time. Obviously, there's this anti-Semitic propaganda and an appeal to German nationalism that was kind of never before seen. Hitler, of course, is famous for his speech making. And National Socialism was sort of the nationalism is literally in the word National Socialism. And anyway, what's interesting though is that a lot of this didn't really take hold until the Depression hit, and there was hyperinflation, and people, prostitutes would accept cigarettes in the street for their services, and people were literally becoming homeless because they couldn't afford bread, not to mention rent. And so all the economy was going to shit, and the Jews, they were doing somewhat better because they were more organized financially. But even though the German people, their enemy was obviously just the wealthy at this point, the 1% who weren't Jewish, but for the most part, but for whatever reason, the Jews were a visible minority that had a little bit more wealth, and that made them just such an easy target. So it was
and one of the reasons that the German Nazis were obviously anti-Semitic from the start, but one of the reasons they put so much of their energy on Jews and not, say, the Western powers that put the Versailles Treaty, which are also against them, is because if they started ranting against them, they would be far less likely to, far more likely to try to remove Hitler from power, as they would see him as more of an overt threat. He tried to at least play nice, kind of verbally with them, even though he had plans to, supersede them later.
Yeah. He actually had a very good ability to get the Western powers to sort of see him as a nice guy for a while.
And obviously, he blamed Jews also for communism, which was not entirely wrong. A lot of the early Bolsheviks were Jewish, even though Stalin was, very likely anti-Semitic. I mean, a lot of the things, very mostly point to that, especially in his later years, that would come out more overtly.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it made enough
Mhm.
sense for people at the time to follow into it.
Mhm.
So what are you saying about France?
So France experienced also a radical change. Obviously, not like it was to the left this time. There was Leon Blum, I believe his name was. He was the first socialist Jewish prime minister who was elected after the Great Depression, sort of in a kind of this left-wing wave in France. I mean, this was the country just 40 years ago, like was in a frenzy over the Dreyfus affair, would elect him, just later, would seem kind of just such how much it changed.
Yeah, really.
Mhm. And there was also the UK. The UK actually stayed relatively stable during this time. We'll get to Italy after this, but the UK, they had, the sort of the UK League of Fascists, but they were treated as a joke. There was kind of this thing. There was this when they gathered up in public. They were so overwhelmed by counter protesters, they had to be like escorted. The police had to separate them. It's called the Battle of Cable Street. So the UK largely maintained more moderate politics.
So wait, who was fighting in this Battle of Cable Street?
It was like there was this group called the UK Union of Fascists that was it was formed by this guy named Oswald Mosley, basically.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, that guy.
he was kind of treated as like he wasn't a serious like player. It was just kind of a joke, though. It was kind of and there were so many counter protesters basically that
Well, similar to the Guy
had
Fawkes. Yeah.
had to call off the thing, and the police had to basically intervene because they were gonna destroy, basically kill each other if they let them get between the counter protesters. But the UK also at the time, that was the rise of Winston Churchill, who'd been involved in a lot of colonial administration and also, a kind of rising statesman within the Conservative Party. It had previously been the Liberal Party, which was kind of before the Labour Party gained prominence. That was
Churchill was seen as he was seen as an outcast in
Oh,
Parliament.
yeah.
Yeah.
And also during this time, you saw a lot of, when you got to the British Empire, like it expanded because of Germany and the Ottoman Empire's territories were split between mostly France and Germany.
Well, yeah, France and France had almost all of West Africa under its dominion.
Yeah, I mean, UK gained Palestine region. I mean, I think I forget which, either France or Germany, and the UK gained Tanzania, a bunch of other territories. I think France gained Syria. I'm not sure. I might be wrong on
Syria,
that.
yeah, they had Syria, and they also had Vietnam and
That was
French Guiana.
But also that time, you saw a lot of more resistance from the local population. First of all, with Gandhi in India, you saw like a heavy campaign of like both civil and somewhat violent resistance to the British rule. And also you had the Arab Revolt in Palestine, which was both against British rule and that the British were allowing more Jews to emigrate to Palestine. They thought that there was a conspiracy to kind of displace them. I mean,
yeah, all these factors made the British economy not very good at the end of World War I. It wasn't in the best shape by any means.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, British actually, in 1936, actually was a response to that, like kind of quelled Jewish immigration in that region. And that was right before the Holocaust. So obviously that
wasn't this a time when for the rise of the Labour Party?
Yeah, Labour Party. It would win the election after the end of World War II, but it was a rising force to be contended with then still. I mean, it was definitely more moderate than other socialist parties, but it still had a lot of, kind of.
And Lloyd George was he left and as the prime minister, and they had another guy whose name I forget who helped stabilize the economy. And then, but then when World War II started coming around and Hitler started being a threat and foreign policy became a more important factor, they got Neville Chamberlain to step in, but he just kind of appeased Hitler. He didn't really take a lot of immediate action.
Yeah, that's what he's famous for. The name's synonymous with appeasement. But so the Great Depression, the effect of the Great Depression, it's two things, both obviously economic, and it shows the effect that the U.S. was gaining both economic power, in the world, that this could have reverberating effects on Europe. Usually most depressions in the U.S. in the past did not have that same effect in Europe. So
yeah, and Scandinavia was at this time was actually starting. All the countries there were starting a lot of social reforms. They kind of what they're famous for now. It all kind of began in the interwar period, or a little bit before, perhaps.
Yeah, you also had culture changes. First, like, movies became popular, radio become common thing that people would possess. Cars started to become more of a, like, more, not still certainly a luxury, but still more common, like, than just like a kind of oddity.
Swing jazz music started reverberate throughout Europe.
This would also show that America was, first of all, gaining cultural dominance because of jazz music. I mean, Disney movies would be exported to Europe, and that became the main form of entertainment. So this was kind of showing America's cultural dominance starting to begin. It wouldn't gain political dominance, at least until the end of World War II.
Did I mention how Woodrow Wilson, when he came in to sign to develop the 14 points, this is the first time that, like, an American president is sort of leading all, like, the European theater in and I believe in Europe, in world history. It's the first time.
Yeah, but he didn't actually join the League of Nations.
No, but it's true. But he was drafting it and officiating over its development. And it's actually funny you say that. George Clemenceau was the premier of France. He said, like, the 14 points, like, that's so boring. Like, even God only gave us 10. It's talking about the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. And it's funny how, like, Woodrow Wilson was there and doing all these decisions and stuff, but why? It's like, even like the people presiding over it didn't really respect him. So it's a very curious thing, I think, that Woodrow Wilson was even at the
we should get
the Treaty of Versailles and all that. Why do you think that Woodrow Wilson was so involved? Like, what's your guess on that?
He wanted, well, first of all, Woodrow Wilson at that point was first of all, he was ailing in health really fast. And for a lot of the end of his presidency, his wife was kind of there, but he just wanted to be done with it. First of all, he didn't want the U.S. to be dragged into this again. And he thought this would kind of, settle things, I guess.
Do you think they viewed him as a third party, sort of a neutral kind of guy?
Well, yeah, I mean, they just wanted, like, they kind of did. I mean, none of the European powers trusted each other, but at least they said America, at least even though it's on the side of the Entente, could be somewhat,
Yeah, it's probably better than the Japanese, the emperor or whatever. Yeah.
Hirohito.
Is Hirohito the emperor then too? Oh.
I believe he was emperor until the 80s, actually. He was, but I don't remember, one of the emperors, but
Okay.
But let's get to Italy.
Italy is super interesting because the Italians, under Benito Mussolini, they were there was this confusion with the Communist Party, which was taking over in strides. And then, so as a retaliation, the Fascist Party developed under Mussolini. And weirdly enough, Hitler thought that Mussolini was like the coolest person ever, and so to speak. And he tried to copy him extensively when he developed National Socialism. And Mussolini was sort of like the precursor to Hitler in terms of
Mussolini. If you look at his history, I mean, he was very much a political chameleon and opportunist. In his earlier days, he had been a prominent socialist, and even sometimes, like, someone delved into anarchism, even like that.
Sure,
but he formed the Fascist Party, and
I don't know if that's chameleonism. I think he might have just been not have figured out what he wanted.
Yeah, but so basically, the Fascist Party, at first, like, if you look at Reedus and
because he developed. Hold on a second. He developed the Fascist Doctrines. He was like one of the main theorists for it.
Yeah, he basically the original Fascist Party document actually had some points that would be considered, somewhat radical, even not like you'd consider like some ultra conservative, guy. But he said, like, we should reform into a republic. The monarchy should be abolished. We want, universal suffrage. But
you're right. And the other thing is, it caught on in Spain also, and they obviously had a civil war over it, where there was the Republicans versus the fascists, and the fascists ended up winning.
Yeah, but in Italy, basically, it didn't come to a war. There were heavy, street brawls between the fascists, because ultimately their ideology moved more conservative and right wing over time, because they saw that lane was more open than that. But they would have famous, street brawls between them and the Reds and the Blacks and stuff like that. But ultimately, the fascists would finally gain to the March on Rome, where a bunch of them, kind of just and the leader of like Italian just agreed to give it to Mussolini, the premiership, basically. I mean, a lot of people say it was a lesser of two evils, but a lot of them also said that he was the only thing who could stop the communists at that point. So it was kind of like Hitler, at
Yeah,
least.
no, it's very similar. The only difference is that the Italians weren't, they didn't have a racist leaning that
No,
I can
Italian
tell.
fascism sort of gains. I mean, it originally it did not have a racial ambition. I mean, kind of you could say Ethiopia. They kind of, their ideology was, when they tried to invade Ethiopia, we're trying to civilize these savage people. But they actually formed it in like kind of humanitarian terms.
It seemed more like they were trying to revitalize the Roman Empire more than anything.
Oh yeah, but when they couched it in somewhat humanitarian terms, even though they were extremely brutal in Ethiopia when they invaded, because that was the last part of Africa that had not been,
Conquered.
colonized.
Yeah, and eventually they would lose Ethiopia.
Yeah, but it was kind of like not at all even fair. Like they basically like had like heavy machine guns against the people that were kind of very lightly armed. Just kind of like they were extremely brutal to the local population. But
but to be fair, the Italians did well for themselves in a way, because they took half of Egypt away from the British, which it was for briefly, but they did, and it's interesting how that kind of worked out. I think the in the interwar period and in World War I and in World War II, the Italians do not look well, or they don't even look competent. But the reality is that further they accomplished their goals, but their goals weren't as ambitious as Hitler. So it's just a difference in scale.
Well, yeah, Mussolini. I mean, they always talk. It's kind of an overestimation how dramatically he kind of changed Italian society. A lot of it did not change as much. Like Hitler and Stalin were totalitarians, and that they changed the entire society around them. Mussolini was like he was dominant in the political sphere, but in the rest of Italian society, he didn't change things that much. He was more kind of, cautious in that respect. I mean, but obviously Mussolini pales in comparison to Hitler. I mean,
but he's also saved from the internal damnation that Hitler's received because he didn't commit any genocides.
Well, he did commit atrocities, but not on the scale of Hitler. I mean, and also the Italians were part of the Entente, the winning side. But one of the reasons they gained power is they thought they didn't gain as much as they should from being on the winning side. Like they didn't gain a lot of the spoils of war, so-called.
Yeah, they wanted Austria. They wanted to control the Balkans. They wanted to control Austria. They were very ambitious in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm. And also there's the Spanish Civil War, which we'll get to.
Yeah. Do you have much to say? Because you can go for it. I didn't look into it much.
Okay, so in Spain hadn't been that prominent in European affairs, and it probably still wasn't at that time. But so Spain, there was a revolution that overthrew the monarch there. It was kind of like that in a wave, like there. But after that, the Second Spanish Republic were formed, and a lot of the Republicans were originally of various sort of more left-wing or socialist factions, albeit of varying degrees. Some were anarchists, some were, Stalinist Soviets, some were, just general socialists, some were non-Soviet communists. So basically it was a very fragile sort of republic. And ultimately there was one of their generals called Francisco Franco, who was mostly active in Africa at that time, who later formed an army of the nationalists who thought that the government was not going to lead, Spain in the right direction. And he wanted to take it back to what he considered its, sort of, true sort of, what would be good for the whole nation. And that was when the Spanish Civil War started. So basically there was the nationalists and the Republicans, Mussolini was involved, but it also became sort of a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the Germans, because they both aided their respective sides. There were even international brigades that formed to volunteer. Like there was this so-called Lincoln Brigade that volunteered for the Republicans, of a lot of people from various nationalities. George Orwell was actually one of them. That's where he wrote Homage to Catalonia.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the Republicans did start losing. I mean, they were less united. They sort of, were less motivated. The morale started to, go lower. Both sides performed atrocities. The Republicans, would gain mass execution of clergy who they saw associated with Franco. the Francoists or the Nationalists would obviously do atrocities like Guernica, bombing of a whole, town that they saw as loyal to the Republicans, and that was where Picasso's famous painting came from.
Are you familiar with Ernest Hemingway and like For Whom the Bell Tolls or Farewell to Arms
Yeah.
or anything? Because
Yeah,
he wrote a lot about the Spanish Civil War also. And he actually was a ambulance driver in the Spanish Civil War. Or was that World War
I
One?
don't know much about him. I know Orwell was involved, but
Ernest Hemingway
he
was
wrote
very
homage to
involved.
Catalonia, which basically there was a part in Catalonia, which is basically like sort of near the French border, kind of the Spanish region, Barcelona's, and parts of Catalonia became controlled by anarchist federations, sort of at one time, and it was pretty, messy. Let's just say, like there wasn't much organization, or kind of things didn't do well. But a lot of them saw it as kind of a utopian dream, sort of realized. It didn't last long. Both the Stalinists and obviously the Nationalists didn't like it, so they were both crushed by that and taken over. But that's what kind of that's what kind of a lot of kind of utopian socialist ideas, at least, were thought to be implemented, with anarchist ideas.
Well, and because this war happened in the late 30s, Franco was able to kind of get the Italians and the Germans to sort of he didn't actually have to join their war against the England and France, because even though he was a fascist and he was like nominally an ally of Germany and Italy, he didn't have to do anything because he was ravaged by the country was just ravaged by the Civil War.
They were officially neutral. I mean, at least Franco was kind of different than Hitler and Mussolini. He was more of just a traditional sort of conservative monarchist.
He was. Yeah. But the reason I say is that they donated a lot of in the effort to help the fascist side. Part of the reason why the fascists won is because they didn't help the Republicans much, the Germans and the Italians, and they helped the fascists, and that's part of the reason why the fascists won. The
Soviet Union helped the Republicans. They, at least their side of the Republicans, they were Stalinists.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know they were that concerned with it. You're saying that, yeah.
Yeah, it was considered like a proxy war between Germany and Russia at that point. But like when we talk about Picasso, we also get to talk about like the art movements that then like
Salvador Dali, Cubism.
Yeah, Dali was a very weird and eccentric guy, let's just say the least. I mean, Picasso, you had Cubism, all these other kind of abstract art movements. You had like these stream of consciousness novels like John Joyce and stuff like that were developed at that time.
Gertrude Stein was an American, but she operated out of Paris. Yeah, there's quite a few people.
Mm-hmm.
It's considered a golden age. Have you ever seen the Woody Allen movie called An American in Paris? Or I think that's what it's called.
No,
Midnight. It's called A Midnight in Paris.
Oh, I've never seen it, but
he goes to Paris in this, in the 1920s, and he's it's pretty good.
Well, yeah. So like you also see culture changing radically. A lot of places that kind of liberalize the old sort of aristocratic values, like fell rapidly out of favor. A lot of them were among World War I veterans that kind of embraced new kind of values, though. Partly because they saw that basically like the establishment had forced them into this dreadful war, and so they wanted nothing to do with the kind of culture of that establishment was one of the reasons.
Yeah, no, one thing that definitely happened in the philosophical culture and just the culture of the arts and architecture and general attitude of people was there's a shift from being like, we use machines because we like what they give us, but we actually care about nature and traditional values. There's a shift from that attitude of like, nature, tradition first and then machinery second. And then it became like, oh no, machinery is actually in working is what we need. And then tradition is kind of a secondary thing. It flip-flopped.
Well, yeah, The Age of the Machine, like Charlie Chaplin has like the Modern Times movie that kind of epitomized that.
Modernity. This is the era that modernity really became a force and became the emblematic of the world, or at least the developed world.
Well, yeah, the industrialization was firmly in place. Kind of the old values were gone. I mean, at least there. But so the start of World War II, or at least the lead up to World War II, was obviously German expansion. I mean, one of the first, well, obviously, let's get into some internal politics. You had the Nuremberg laws, which were kind of like it was kind of like the idea of the frog in the boiling water. If you try to put like the huge danger in first, you'll jump out like of the thing. But if you do it slowly over time, they'll be cooked to death.
Yeah,
So
kind of like
basically, they
now. Yeah,
slowly sort
kind
of
of like COVID.
yeah, they slowly disenfranchise, basically, kind of disempower and strip the rights of Jews and other minorities away slowly, sort of. But ultimately, it was, obviously up to the Holocaust. That was their initial plan from all along. As much as some people try to deny it. But so
Well, I want to say,
internally, like, we also had mass euthanasia of disabled people.
yeah, yeah. No,
This
it
G4
wasn't a good
program.
time to be anyone different at all.
Yeah, definitely. You had suppression of, sort of one of the more kind of avant-garde arts in the Nazi era.
Yeah, I mean, even artists, were persecuted just for being eccentric.
Yeah, artists both in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, basically all the totalitarian regimes, they were persecuted. I mean, everything had to line up with the regime's ideology and its,
I want to talk. I want to
supported.
talk a bit about the Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania, Bulgaria. Um, one thing I'll say is that Serbia was interesting because they kind of, took pride in having the Black Hand to assassinate, Franz Ferdinand starting World War One, sparking it, and so even though their economy wasn't great by any means, there was like a pride that they had that no other country really had because they sort of changed the world. But that was kind of it for them. Yugoslavia had a guy called Tito in power who was extremely
Well, Tito was after World War II. I mean,
no, he was. I think he was leading up to World War II and after World War.
Yeah, okay.
He was leading up to it. It wasn't just he wasn't just like installed after World War II. And he was very charismatic, and he kind of helped keep the Slavic countries sort of in the Balkans unified, just by force of personality almost.
Well, you'd have the Croatians who would later join the Ustas, who kind of committed ethnic cleansing around that era. They were allied with the Nazis, but at least until then, it was somewhat peaceful,
Yeah, yeah, and of course, all these countries were like really had a hard time managing their budgets, and it made when the stock market crashed, it all got worse for them too, but especially for Hungary. But funnily enough, the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia really was very good at its budget, and they were making a lot of strides in their administration. But then, of course, they get invaded by the Germans. The Sudetenland. So there's a little bit of irony there.
So first of all, Hitler did a bunch of things. Like, first of all, he brought the military back into the Rhineland, which was
which country? Remind me, which country again sided with the Nazis? Was it Bulgaria?
It was Croatia.
Croatia, I think, but then Bulgaria sided with the Central Powers.
A lot of those countries, they cooperated with the Nazis, let's just say, well, regardless of what their leaders, because they were like the dominant force there, at least until the Soviets took over, then they cooperated with them. But so the first things he did was he brought troops back into the Rhineland, which a lot of the other powers are more likely to kind of say, well, it's just their territory anyway. It's been a long time since World War One. Let's just, even though it violates the term, let's just let them do this. And then later they annexed other territories. They first tried to, annex Austria, which Austria actually welcomed. They considered themselves ethnic Germans. They'd been controlled by their own sort of fascist government until then. So they were they were like gathering in the streets to welcome Hitler when he decided to annex them, basically. But it still was kind of at least a violation of what was considered then international law. A lot of it wasn't that developed. But
what's interesting to me is that you have all these countries, and we can debate whether or not they actually meant what they said, and we can debate like how if they were being if they were just being compliant with the Nazis. But you have to, if you look at Eastern Europe, the Balkans, most of these countries gave support to the Nazis. Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia. And then also you can't forget that in all the countries that were newly established in the Baltic region, they probably preferred the Germans to the Russians.
Well, yeah, right? The Russians were brutal to them. Like they would send them to gulags, have forced labor. The Russians treated virtually all of their, territories, east of them, especially Ukraine, basically like very brutally. I mean, at least a lot of the Ukrainians were brutalized by the Nazis, but later in World War II, at first they were going to welcome them as liberators.
Well,
Estonians
that reminds me,
actually,
we have to do this whole World War II podcast following
yeah.
this one.
Yeah, but like the especially like the Estonians, the Nazis were nicer to after that. But that's like later in World War II. But so basically, Hitler then went after the Sudetenland and ultimately tried annexed Czechoslovakia, and that was one of the things that originally kind of they still tried to appease him at that point, like Neville Chamberlain and the others. But that was kind of when they said, okay, this is a serious problem. We're going to draw a line in the sand at Poland. He did this on the basis of saying there were a lot of ethnic Germans who lived in these lands and they needed more Lebensraum or living room for the
Yeah,
German
yeah.
population because they say it was growing and stuff like
Was
that.
it the same time as the Night of Broken Glass? Around the same time?
Oh, Kristallnacht. Yeah, that was like basically a huge like eruption against Jewish businesses. It was considered kind of one of the huge precursors to the Holocaust. When the Holocaust was first implemented by forming into ghettos, but that was considered kind of one of the point where it's like almost inevitable.
And weren't a lot of those ghettos in Prague and Vienna, like
and Warsaw, like when they invaded them later.
Warsaw, yeah, and of course there was the Anschluss where the Austrians were just taken over by the Germans.
Well, yeah, but so they annexed
do you know if the Sudetenland, which was Austria or is it Czech Republic that was taken over first? Czech Republic.
Austria was taken over first.
Okay.
And then the Allies, of course, draw the line in the sand at Poland. There were parts of parts of the world formed of Poland had previously been part of Germany, and the Germans basically gave an ultimatum to Poland to let them annex certain parts of their land, and then basically, obviously, the Polish refused, and that's when the invasion of Poland was done, which would be the trigger to World War II, basically, when the Allies would stop appeasing them. But of course, it was a little too late to avoid the total bloodbath. I mean,
yeah, and you can't forget.
And there was, of course, before that, there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Nazis and the Soviet Union. That was viewed with kind of disdain by leaders in both countries who considered them mortal enemies. A lot of people say it was a peace treaty, but it was more just a treaty on how to divide Poland because they both invaded basically simultaneously.
Do you think that Stalin supported the Nazis initially, or do you think that he was just trying to?
Well, he never supported them. He's willing to work with them. I mean,
no, but I'm saying like versus the Western Europe, like who do you think that he would have wanted to work with more?
They were both enemies. They considered them both, sort of, capitalist enemies, but I think,
sure.
I mean, at least the Nazis, he considered they had somewhat of an ideology, that he could at least agree with some points on, like nationalization of the economy, but obviously they were both enemies.
Yeah.
Certain nationalization. I mean, Hitler allowed some private businesses as long as they were like loyal to him, which was different from the sort of Soviet idea of like basically everything is under the government control.
Because it seems to me that in World War II, unlike in World War One, the Russians are they're almost like Johnny come lately. It's like they don't take a lot of immediate action.
It's kind of weird. Like basically like Lenin had built on a lot of Marx's ideas because Marx basically he talked a lot about capitalism, how he thought it worked, but he was very vague on what socialism would be like, other than some vague principles, like each according to his principle and the ability to each according to his need. But other than that, Lenin formed a lot of the ideas, and his idea was basically the dictatorship of the proletariat, which meant that they had to take control and that government had to grow to largest. So, because like the end goal of Marxism is some sort of vague, stateless society, utopia. But they said before that the government had to grow to like huge lengths so they could like the proletariat could take over all the institutions basically, and then some sort of time later, once they had conquered the world and like or liberated the world as they thought, the state would just kind of wither away. I mean, sounds like mystical thinking because it really is mystical thinking, but at least that's how it has, So that was kind of.
I think that's a good moment to stop, and we can talk about everything else in the next podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we should at least, but basically, so that was going to be the start of World War II. I mean, obviously,
one thing I will say is that the Japanese were doing their imperialistic conquering.
Yeah, they were invading China.
Invaded China. They established Manchukuo, which was in Manchuria. It was just their government there. And so they were kind of the Nazis and the Axis powers were thinking about what the fuck's going on with Japan, and a lot of not negotiations, but what's it called? Delegations or whatever. A lot of
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously
communication was going on
they
in
were
the leadership.
hundreds of miles apart, but Nazi Germany and Italy kind of did form an alliance with them. I mean, a lot of it was just on paper because they weren't really involved in each other's affairs to too great a degree, but they still saw them as like a nationalistic sort of ally, at least that could, kind of subdue, I mean, at least the the Eastern colonial possessions of the crew of powers they were against.
All right.
And they also,
I like it.
yeah.
All right, let's end the podcast. Let me
Okay, well, next one we'll be talking about World War II and proper and its immediate aftermath.
sounds good.